Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! A woman in Da Nang was stopped in 1972 after police said she carried 15 hidden explosive devices during a night clash. The case became one of the most chilling arrest photos from wartime Vietnam. A Stasi agent near East Berlin was caught photographing an American CIA agent who was photographing him back in the 1960s. Two rival spies recorded each other at the same moment in one of the Cold War's strangest standoffs. Mike Tyson once shook hands with Dale Hausner, who introduced himself as a sports journalist in Phoenix. Days later, police told Tyson the man was linked to 8 lost lives. A famous British band played in Paris in 1965 with only a small maze of cables, amps, and basic stage gear beneath them. The overhead view shows how huge concerts once ran with far less equipment than a single modern sound desk. American soldiers in Vietnam were filmed using a rifle as an improvised smoking pipe in 1968. The strange scene became a blunt snapshot of how far battlefield boredom and stress could push young men. Saddam Hussein was photographed firing a pistol in the 1980s after rising from rural poverty to become Iraq's ruler. He claimed he had handled firearms since childhood, long before gaining power in Baghdad. Albert Einstein walked through Princeton in the early 1950s with papers in hand, while his secretary Helen Dukas followed behind with his dog Chico. One of the world's most famous minds spent his final years on quiet New Jersey streets, far from the global fame around his name. A North African civilian leaned into the cockpit of an American A-36 Mustang, while a camel stood beside the aircraft in 1943. The photo captures one of the strangest contrasts of the war. Desert transport beside a dive bomber built for high-speed attack. An Afghan woman collected yellow supply bags dropped by the American Army in 2001. Hundreds of bright packages lay across the empty ground, turning one quiet moment into a striking record of the first weeks of the war. Lenin's giant head was lifted from Lenin Square in East Berlin in 1991, 2 years after the Berlin Wall fell. The statue was cut into 129 pieces, turning a symbol of Soviet power into buried fragments outside the city. A farming family in Wierchomla Wielka, Poland, pulled a wooden cart through the fields in 1976. The woman pushing from behind was pregnant with her 12th child. A London shop sold glowing flowers in 1940 so people could be seen during wartime blackouts. The small dress clips cost 6 pence and turned safety into something people could wear. 3 Irish guards examined a captured German machine gun at Pilcombe Ridge in 1917 while wearing enemy body armor. The heavy steel plates were meant to stop fragments, but they made movement slow and exhausting in the mud. Hillary Clinton played a Nintendo Game Boy on a flight in 1993 during her first year as First Lady. She later said she became hooked on it while spending long hours at her father's hospital bedside. Lorne Michaels held up a $3,000 check on live television in 1976, jokingly offering it for the Beatles to reunite. John Lennon later said he and Paul McCartney were together that night and briefly considered going to the studio. Italian workers packed munitions at the Suter Tevno factory near Milan in 1917, surrounded by rows of shell parts. The factory exploded on June 7, 1918, turning this quiet workroom into a haunting before picture. Russian officers rode an ice yacht across a frozen surface in 1908, using a sail instead of a motor. These fast winter boats were a favorite sport of elite officers before the old empire disappeared. A Moscow lightning lab in the 1950s used giant machines to create artificial electric arcs indoors. Engineers studied these controlled flashes to protect power lines, buildings, and equipment from real storms. A 1965 school photo from Leningrad includes young Vladimir Putin among dozens of 6th grade students. The ordinary classroom picture became famous because one child in it later became Russia's president. German submarine U-505 was moved across Chicago's lakefront in 1954 after becoming the first enemy warship captured by the United States, since 1815. The 76-meter vessel later became a museum exhibit, hiding a rare wartime code machine inside its story. Miners worked a coal pit at Karsuarsuk, Greenland in 1889, pushing loaded carts beside a frozen Arctic shore. The photo shows industrial labor at the edge of the world, where coal was dug by hand in one of the harshest work settings of the 1800s. An AMO-3 truck was photographed during the Moscow to Karakum motor rally in 1933, forcing its way across a rough water crossing with locals watching from both sides. The grueling route tested Soviet vehicles over deserts, broken tracks, and places where roads barely existed. A water carrier at Sheremenets Monastery collected water from an ice hole in 1913, using a horse and sled to haul a large barrel through the snow. Before pipes reached most rural Russia, winter water was often pulled this way by hand from frozen lakes and rivers. Soviet defenders sheltered in muddy trenches near Leningrad in 1941 as the city faced one of the longest sieges of the 20th century. The blockade lasted 872 days and became one of the harshest civilian survival stories in modern history. Crowds in Austria greeted German troops with smiles and raised hands during the 1938 Anschluss. The same moment that looked like celebration became one of the first major steps toward the collapse of peace in Europe. A French airship floated above the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis when flight still looked like a public miracle. Crowds watched from below as airships and early airplanes competed to become the future of travel. A worker at Don Pablo Cigar Company in Las Vegas rolled cigars by hand in 1996, surrounded by wooden molds and stacks of finished boxes. Each cigar passed through a slow manual process before reaching the bright Casino City outside. In 1995, President Bill Clinton signed a law ending the federal 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. After 21 years, individual states could set their own highway limits again. Anna Nicole Smith posed with her husband J. Howard Marshall on Christmas Eve in 1994 during their brief and heavily discussed marriage. It was his final Christmas, and he died the next year at age 90. A United States Marine moved through deep mud in Bosnia in 1995 as NATO troops began their first major ground mission there. The deployment marked a turning point from years of conflict toward an international peacekeeping presence. Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky were photographed together at the White House on November 15, 1995, the day their relationship reportedly began. The photo later became tied to one of the biggest political scandals of the 1990s. Philadelphia dumped snow from a 30-inch storm into the Schuylkill River in 1996 after the city was buried under record winter weather. The frozen piles were pushed straight off a bridge because the streets had nowhere left to hold them. The Kravica warehouse near Srebrenica became one of the darkest sites of the Bosnian War in July 1995. More than 1,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys lost their lives there in a single day. Thousands filled Moscow streets for Vladimir Mayakovsky's funeral in 1930, turning a poet's farewell into a massive public procession. He was one of the Soviet Union's most famous writers, and his death at age 36 shocked the country. Paris opened its 1900 World Fair beneath the Eiffel Tower, showing millions of visitors electric lights, moving walkways, and early film. More than 50 million people attended, making it one of the biggest showcases of the modern age. 4 young sailors saluted Anatoly Golombievsky in 1989, a Second World War veteran who had lost both legs. The image became powerful because the highest respect is given to a man standing only on his hands. Allied troops helped a French woman take cover in Chartres in 1944 during the city's liberation. The street scene shows how civilians were caught in the middle as the final battles moved through France. Children walked back to classes in ruined Stalingrad in 1943, soon after one of the largest battles in history ended. More than 1 million people were lost in the battle, yet school lessons resumed among broken walls and rubble. A German officer gave orders during the Battle of Kerch in 1942 as troops moved across the open Crimean terrain. The fight for Kerch became one of the key battles for control of the eastern gateway to Crimea. Free French soldiers burned a Nazi flag in southern Germany in 1945 as Allied forces pushed into the collapsing Third Reich. The photo captures a stunning reversal of power with a symbol of occupation destroyed near the end of the war. A German soldier posed on the head of a Lenin statue in 1942 during the invasion of Soviet territory. The image turns a monument of Soviet power into a captured trophy for the camera. This Panzer IV was covered with extra track links, turning spare parts into improvised armor. Crews used this crude upgrade to add protection where factory steel was not enough. American troops moved through Garapan on Saipan in 1944 as wooden buildings burned around them. The capture of Saipan put United States bombers within range of Japan's home islands. New York Police Captain Albert Seidman held a suspect's face toward the camera in 1962 so reporters could get a clear photo. The image shows how public crime coverage once turned arrests into harsh, street-level spectacles. In the late 1920s, tobacco companies used stylish young women in public scenes to make smoking look modern and rebellious. The campaign helped turn a social taboo into a mass-market habit aimed directly at women. A man was photographed in Nicaragua in 1979 holding a rifle and a flaming bottle during the final days of the Somoza government. Susan Miselis's image became one of the most famous visual symbols of the Sandinista revolution. A British soldier came home in 1945 holding his 8-month-old daughter on the dock. For many returning fathers, the end of the war meant meeting children who had grown up while they were away. Ernest and Roger Violet tested a small balloon in Brunoy, France in 1891 when flight was still an experiment for daring inventors. The fragile paper-like craft shows how early aviation began with backyard trials before airplanes existed. Senior Sergeant Ivan Lubushkin stood beside his T-34 near Moscow in late 1941, already known as one of the top Soviet tank aces. He was credited with at least 20 enemy tanks before dying in 1942 at age 23. A strange 1893 design showed two people sharing connected protective masks through a single heart-shaped filter. The idea looked romantic, but it turned survival gear into one of the most unsettling couple inventions ever pictured. The Sun Pod from 1982 let people lie outdoors under a clear cover while reducing direct sun exposure. It looked like a tiny personal beach capsule, decades before modern portable sun shelters became common. Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 crashed in the Andes in 1972 with 45 people on board. Only 16 survived after 72 days trapped in the snow at high altitude. Qusay Hussein, Saddam Hussein's younger son, was photographed at a social event in the 1980s, raising a revolver into the air. The scene shows how power in Iraq's ruling family could appear openly even during private celebration. Mildred Burke pinned a reporter in 1947 while calmly filing her nails for the camera. She became one of wrestling's first female superstars and spent decades proving that the ring was not only for men. In 1962, Graham and Barbara Brown carried their daughters up Mount Ogwen in Wales, including 17-day-old Rosalind and 19-month-old Susan. One child rode in a back seat while the newborn was carried in a box across the rocks. An American stunt performer hung beneath a Goodyear airship about 1 kilometer above the ground. The photo captures a time when aviation shows used real human daring to turn a blimp into a flying stage. A Leon County sheriff read Ted Bundy the indictment linked to the Chi Omega case in Florida. The calm hallway photo became chilling because Bundy was standing only steps from the trial that would end with a death sentence. A Motorola radio telephone from the early 1950s let people make mobile calls decades before pocket cell phones existed. The device was so large that wireless still meant carrying a machine almost the size of a handbag. The Dahomey Women's Guard was one of the few fully female military units documented in world history. These soldiers served the West African Kingdom of Dahomey, now Benin, until the late 1800s. A Swiss soldier guarded a high alpine post in 1918, watching the front between Austrian and Italian forces from neutral territory. Switzerland stayed out of the war, but its mountain troops still stood armed in snow above Europe's battle lines. A man chipped pieces from the Berlin Wall near the Brandenburg Gate on November 10, 1989. Within hours of the border opening, thousands crossed freely between East and West Berlin for the first time in decades. Freedom Riders arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, on May 24, 1961, under police and National Guard protection. The group challenged segregated bus travel, turning one bus stop into a national test of civil rights. Civil rights leaders held a press conference in Montgomery on May 23, 1961, announcing that the Freedom Rides would continue. One rider sat with a bandaged head, showing the heavy price behind the fight to desegregate interstate bus travel. Wembley Stadium's car park was packed before the 1936 FA Cup final between Arsenal and Sheffield United. The rows of cars show how a football match already pulled a modern traffic crowd nearly 90 years ago. Crowds packed the gates of Graceland in Memphis on August 17, 1977, waiting to say goodbye to Elvis Presley. More than 30,000 people came to view him, turning his home into one of the largest public farewells in music history. Elvis Presley performed in Providence, Rhode Island on May 23, 1977, just 3 months before his death. The concert photo shows one of his final stage chapters after more than 20 years as America's biggest rock and roll icon. Staff Sergeant Arthur Moore stood on crutches in New York on May 7, 1945, as paper filled the streets for victory celebrations. Wounded in Belgium, he watched the city mark the end of the war in Europe from 42nd Street. New Yorkers crowded Times Square on May 7, 1945, cheering around a man wearing an Adolf Hitler mask after Germany's surrender was announced. The strange celebration turned the face of a fallen dictator into a public joke on the day Europe's war was ending. The B-17 Eradicate survived the 452nd Bomb Group's entire Europe tour with 120 recorded combat missions. After making it home to the United States, the rare survivor was still scrapped instead of preserved. Sergeant Alvin C. York returned home to Pall Mall, Tennessee in 1919 and was met by his mother at the door. He became one of America's most famous World War I soldiers after capturing 132 enemy troops in a single action. Elvis Presley sat beside Roy Orbison around 1957 when both were still young stars shaping the sound of rock and roll. Presley later called Orbison the greatest singer in the world, while Orbison said Elvis was the firstest with the mostest. A Mongolian rider sits on a Przewalski's horse in an autochrome taken on the 6th of July, 1913. Przewalski's horse is the last truly wild horse species, and by the 1960s it had disappeared from the wild before later reintroduction. Ken McElroy's truck sat shattered after he was killed in broad daylight in Missouri in 1981. More than 40 people were nearby, but no one was ever charged. Chaki, a British officer in late 1800s, India read a newspaper, while one servant cooled him with a palm fan and another tended his feet. The staged comfort in the photo exposes the extreme social gap inside the colonial world. Lord Robert Bulwer-Lytton ruled British India from 1876 to 1880 in robes of imperial power. During his rule, the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 took about 8 million lives from hunger and disease. Gordon Parks photographed Atlanta Airport in 1956, showing black and white passengers seated side by side during the era of segregation. The quiet waiting room scene captures a country changing in public spaces before the law fully caught up. Women workers at a New Hampshire timber salvage sawmill rested after lunch in 1943 while doing wartime forestry work for the United States Department of Agriculture. Jobs like these moved women into heavy outdoor labor as the war pulled millions of men away from civilian work. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth held their baby daughter in 1926, long before she became Queen Elizabeth II. The child in lace would later rule Britain for 70 years, the longest reign in the country's history. Troops stood at the gates of Afghanistan's presidential palace in Kabul on April 28, 1978, after the communist Sour Revolution seized power. The takeover reshaped the country and helped set Afghanistan on a path toward years of foreign intervention and civil war. Daisy and Violet Hilton posed at Atlantic City's Steel Pier after becoming famous vaudeville performers in the early 1900s. Born as conjoined twins in England, they spent decades earning crowds for managers before later winning legal freedom. Adrian Jeftichou became a famous Russian sideshow performer in the 1800s because hypertrichosis covered much of his face with hair. He later adopted Fedor Jeftichou, who had the same rare condition, and showmen sold them as a father and son act across Europe. Abdul Wali was an Afghan farmer who turned himself in to clear his name after being falsely accused in 2003. He died in custody 3 days later after severe abuse by a CIA contractor. Harvard graduate student Jane Britton missed an exam in 1969 and was found dead in her apartment hours later. The case stayed unsolved for nearly 50 years until DNA evidence finally pointed to her killer. Officials stood inside the 3 Mile Island control room after the 1979 reactor accident in Pennsylvania. The partial meltdown was rated level 5 and became the most serious nuclear power accident in United States history. Nelly Rivas was a 14-year-old Argentine girl linked to Juan Perón during his second presidency. After Perón was overthrown in 1955, she was sent to a minors' institution and her life was permanently changed. John "Mad Jack" Churchill was a British officer who went into World War II carrying a longbow, a Scottish sword, and bagpipes. He became famous for bringing medieval weapons into modern battle and surviving some of the war's most unbelievable moments. Fifth Avenue in New York looked almost empty in 1877, with horse-drawn carriages moving over icy winter streets. Decades before cars and skyscrapers took over, one of the world's busiest avenues still moved at the speed of horses. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill later became wartime allies, but their first meeting in 1918 reportedly left Roosevelt annoyed for years. By 1939, he was still privately recalling Churchill's behavior at dinner as rude. General Dwight Eisenhower tried on a Bersaglieri feathered hat in 1951, years before becoming United States President. The dramatic plume belonged to Italy's elite light infantry, famous for marching at a running pace. A Mid-Autumn Festival was held in Viet Minh-controlled south-central Vietnam in 1951, with children, musicians, soldiers, and foreign volunteers gathered together. The scene shows a rare quiet celebration inside a war zone. A Georgian fighter waited behind a corner in Tbilisi on December 30, 1991, during clashes between rival political forces. The street fighting came just as the Soviet Union collapsed, pulling Georgia into civil war almost immediately. Anwar Sadat saluted beside Hosni Mubarak and Abu Ghazala during Egypt's military parade on October 6, 1981. It became his last public salute, and Mubarak would lead Egypt for the next 29 years. Himmler's Hegewald bunker near Zhytomyr was built in 1941 to 1942 as a secret command site only 8 kilometers from the city. Its 4.5-meter-thick walls later became ordinary storage cellars, hiding one of the darkest planning sites of the Third Reich in plain sight. Asian American protesters marched in Los Angeles in 1971 against United States involvement in Vietnam. Their signs linked the war to Asian identity, making the protest both a peace march and a civil rights statement. Parisians waved as Santos Dumont 6 flew near the Eiffel Tower in 1901 during one of aviation's first great public triumphs. Alberto Santos Dumont won the Deutsch Prize after flying from St. Cloud to the tower and back in under 30 minutes. Twin sisters Betty and Nancy Debenham rode a BSA motorcycle in 1928 with their dog Poncho sitting up front. They helped sell motorcycling to women through magazines and BSA advertising when the road was still seen as a man's world. Women in Kenya trained with wooden rifles during the Mau Mau uprising against British colonial rule in the 1950s. The conflict became one of the most intense anti-colonial struggles in East Africa before Kenya gained independence in 1963. Isambard Kingdom Brunel stood with colleagues during the launch of the SS Great Eastern around 1857 to 1858. The ship was so huge for its time that it remained the largest vessel in the world for decades. Sardar Udham Singh survived the 1919 Jallianwala Bagh massacre and carried its memory for 21 years. In 1940, he killed former Punjab official Michael O'Dwyer in London and became a symbol of revenge against British rule. A blue whale skeleton hung inside the Singapore Museum in 1908, showing visitors the largest animal on Earth at full scale. Blue whales can grow longer than 30 meters, making even their bones look like architecture. The Santa Lucia Bridge in Uruguay linked Montevideo and San Jose in 1925, turning a river crossing into a modern road route. Cars and pedestrians shared the steel span when bridges like this were still symbols of national progress. A barrage balloon lay beside the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow in 1941 as the city prepared for air raids. These balloons lifted steel cables into the sky to make low-flying attacks far more dangerous. British Bow fighters struck the Italian liner Rex near the coast in 1944, ending the story of a ship once famous for Atlantic speed records. The 268-meter luxury giant burned for days before it was later broken up for scrap. A Soviet B-4 203mm howitzer fired near Danzig in 1945 during the final months of the war in Europe. Nicknamed Stalin's sledgehammer, this gun was built to break heavy fortifications with shells weighing about 100 kilograms. A mountain of bison bones towered at Detroit Carbon Works in 1873, waiting to be turned into animal charcoal, glue, and fertilizer. The pile shows the industrial scale of bison loss in North America during the 1800s. A Tel Aviv commuter bus was torn open on July 24, 1995, after a Hamas attacker struck during morning travel. 6 Israelis died and 28 were wounded, making the crowded bus one of the starkest images of the violence of that year. A firefighter walked past crushed cars outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995. The blast killed 168 people and became the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in United States history. Irish Republicans seized Dublin's General Post Office on April 24, 1916, and declared an Irish Republic inside the city's main communications hub. The Easter Rising was crushed within days, but it became a turning point in Ireland's path to independence. Stalin and Roosevelt portraits hung together at Poltava Air Base during rare Soviet-American wartime cooperation. The base let United States bombers hit Europe and land on Soviet soil. Charles de Gaulle walked with his daughter Anne in the 1930s before becoming France's wartime symbol of resistance. Anne had Down syndrome, and de Gaulle was known to be deeply devoted to her. Jessica Lange rested beside King Kong's giant prop hand during filming in 1976 in her first major movie role. The film made her famous overnight, but she later rebuilt her career into 2 Oscar wins. Irving Penn photographed 2 children in Cusco, Peru, turning a simple studio pose into one of his most haunting portraits. Their oversized hats, bare feet, and steady faces made the image unforgettable. Diana, the future Princess of Wales, sat with a small pony in Scotland in 1974. The quiet countryside photo was taken 7 years before her royal wedding, made her one of the most photographed women in the world. Benito Mussolini stands with German troops after the raid that freed him from captivity at the Gran Sasso Mountain Hotel in Italy on September 12, 1943. He had been arrested after being overthrown, and the rescue led by Otto Skorzeny returned him to Nazi control. A German paratrooper aimed an MG-42 from cover during World War II. The weapon fired up to 1,200 rounds per minute, making it one of the most feared machine guns of the war. Russian soldiers advanced through open grass on the Eastern Front during the World War I. The front stretched for hundreds of kilometers, turning fields and villages into a massive moving battlefield. A couple watched an early 3D film in Paris in 1936, wearing bulky dark glasses decades before modern cinema glasses. Their date captured one of the first public steps toward movies that tried to jump off the screen. A Yemeni rabbi listened to a radio in 1935 when broadcasts could bring distant voices into one quiet room. The photo captures an old religious world meeting a new machine of the modern age. Gaspar Vollnofer was photographed in 1917 as Austria's oldest soldier of World War I at age 79. He had already served in the Habsburg campaigns of 1848 and 1866 before wearing a uniform again. Martin Pistorius spent 12 years trapped in his own body, unable to speak while still hearing the world around him. By 16, his mind began waking up again, turning his story into one of the rarest survival cases ever recorded. Marvin and Ethel Brandland were handing out Halloween candy in 1982 when a masked visitor turned their doorway into a crime scene. Marvin was killed at age 69, and the case remains unsolved despite the mask being left behind. In 1968, 3 Motown stars met a senior British royal while wearing matching pearl-covered gowns that turned the handshake into a historic pop culture moment. The group became one of the most successful vocal acts of the decade, with 12 #1 songs in the United States. Michael Jackson was 11 years old when this Gardner Street School photo was taken in 1969. In 1970, his group reached #1 in the United States 4 times, and his normal school life was already gone. In 1939, many farm kitchens still used heavy wood stoves like this, where cooking meant feeding the fire before feeding the family. One meal could take hours because heat, smoke, and timing all had to be controlled by hand. A senior United States official watches live television from his office as the 2001 national crisis unfolds on screen. Within hours, United States airspace was cleared, and the day became one of the most recorded moments in modern history. In 1937, this Tennessee fruit worker's family was camped in a field near a packing house in Winter Haven, Florida. During the Great Depression, families often followed harvest jobs across states just to keep earning food money. A performer with a rare limb difference smiles while holding a book and cigar, turning a simple studio portrait into a striking piece of show history. Before his long stage career, he worked as a newspaper boy. In the 1960s, members of this church held live snakes during services because they believed a Bible passage promised protection. The ritual continued for decades in small groups, even after more than 70 people were reported to have lost their lives. In 1967, a former Austrian wartime officer stood inside his Madrid home after building a second life in Spain. After 1945, he became a military advisor abroad, turning this calm room into a strange post-war chapter. An Oscar-winning actor stands beside his father in early 1980s New York, back-to-back like two men from different worlds. His father was a serious painter, and the actor later called him one of the artists he admired most. In 1976, a famous 7-foot 4-inch performer played Bigfoot on the $6 Million Man, making the creature look huge without camera tricks. The episode became one of the show's most remembered appearances, mixing television science fiction with real-life size. In 1915, SS Falaba was struck by German U-boat U-28, and the camera caught the huge water column rising beside the ship. The event became historic because 104 people were lost, including the first United States citizen lost in the First World War. Born in India in 1888, the sisters became international sideshow performers as children and appeared at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. They spoke 4 languages, including Hindi, English, French, and German. In 1964, a Cambodian dancer posed at Angkor Wat with a painted mask used in classical performance. Angkor Wat was built in the 12th century and remains one of Cambodia's most famous cultural symbols. In 1945, French political deportees marched down the Champs-Élysées during the Victory Parade, still wearing striped camp clothes. Their return through Paris showed a hidden cost of the war. Only a small number had come back. In 1944, the man in the center was praised as a resistance leader who helped free the French town of Loches. Soon after, officials found he had used a false name, turning this liberation photo into one of France's strangest post-war scandals. Marilyn Monroe led the Miss America parade in Atlantic City in 1952, just before her fame exploded across Hollywood. 1 year later, she was starring in major films and becoming one of the most photographed women on Earth. Hans Schmidt was a Catholic priest in New York whose secret life with Anna Aumiller turned into a national scandal in 1913. He remains the only Catholic priest in United States history to receive the final legal sentence for a crime. In 1968, a South Vietnamese paratrooper carried an injured Viet Cong soldier for medical help during the Tet Offensive. At that time, many South Vietnamese units still used older World War II rifles, while the M16 was limited to select forces. In 1911, the British royal family visited India for a grand imperial tour filled with ceremonies and private tiger hunts. During that trip, King George V's party was reported to have hunted 39 tigers in just 10 days. On April 9, 1917, Canadian troops took most of Vimy Ridge, a position that had resisted earlier attacks for years. They also took 5 nearby villages and about 6,000 German prisoners in one of Canada's most famous First World War victories. In May 1945, these Soviet women marksmen posed with medals after serving on the First Belarusian Front. Their unit record listed 775 confirmed battlefield targets, making this one of the most intense women's military portraits of World War II. In 1950, Matsutani Tenkoko held her child while serving as one of the first women in Japan's parliament. Only 39 women won seats in Japan's 1946 election, making this quiet portrait part of a new political era. Mehmed Kemal Bey faced an Ottoman military tribunal in Allied-occupied Istanbul in April 1919 for his role in the wartime persecution of Armenians. The case came under Entente pressure and became one of the first major Ottoman trials after World War I. Operation Avalanche began near Salerno in September 1943, not 1942, as United States troops packed onto transport ships for mainland Italy. The landing started the Allied push up Italy only days after Italy announced its armistice. USS Liberty reached Malta with heavy damage after Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats struck the ship on June 8, 1967. The official explanation called it mistaken identity, but survivors said the American flag was visible and 34 crew members lost their lives. In May 1921, rural workers marched through Puerto Santa Cruz under a banner reading, "Long live May 1st, long live solidarity." The protest wave became Rebellious Patagonia, one of Argentina's harshest labor conflicts of the 20th century. In 1945, Soviet soldiers posed beside the damaged Reichstag after Berlin fell in the final days of World War II. The building became the most famous symbol of victory in Europe after the red flag was raised on its roof. Semyon Nomokhanov was a Soviet marksman from Siberia who became one of the most recorded sharpshooters of World War II. His official count was listed as 367 enemy soldiers, and his medals made him a wartime legend in the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, Hotel Stadt Berlin towered over Alexanderplatz with 37 floors of strict East German modern design. The building opened in 1970 with about 2,000 beds and became one of East Berlin's biggest showcase hotels. On November 8, 1937, a strength-through-joy cruise ship met the German heavy cruiser Deutschland in the Mediterranean Sea. The scene mixed vacation travel with military power just 2 years before Europe changed completely. In late 1977, Charlie Chaplin and Una O'Neill were photographed in Switzerland, where he had lived since the 1950s. He was 88 years old, and this quiet walk came in the final year of a film career that began before sound cinema. In July 1863, 3 Confederate prisoners from Gettysburg were photographed with worn clothes, rifles, and bedrolls just after one of America's biggest Civil War battles. Gettysburg lasted 3 days and changed the course of the war, making this a rare close view of the losing side. Lot Polish Airlines flight attendants lined up beside an Ilyushin passenger plane in 1968, when air travel still looked rare and formal. Their uniforms, hats, and careful pose show how flying was presented as a symbol of status in communist Poland. Deadwood, South Dakota Territory, grew fast after gold was found in the Black Hills in 1876. By 1878, its wooden streets packed miners, saloons, and new businesses 11 years before South Dakota became a state. American B-17 flying fortresses from the 91st Bomb Group flew over Kiel, Germany on January 4, 1944, leaving bright contrails above the coast. Kiel was a major naval city, so this mission put the crews over one of Germany's most heavily guarded areas. In 1921, a Ford Model T rolled down a steep San Francisco hill, showing how early cars faced streets built before engines ruled the city. The Model T had about 20 horsepower and no modern four-wheel brakes, making this simple ride look risky today. In 1924, 2 young Native American women posed in Omaha before a beauty contest in Pendleton, Oregon. Their braids, beadwork, feathered headbands, and shell earrings made this portrait a rare close view of Native pageant dress from that era. In 1920, Japanese schoolgirls wore protective face masks while walking in line during a major flu wave. The photo looks modern because Japan was using public masking more than 100 years ago. In New York, ironworkers ate lunch on a steel girder, 20 stories above Vesey Street, while building a telephone company skyscraper. No harnesses or guardrails are visible, making this quiet lunch break look unreal today. The first Olympic village was built for the 1924 Paris Games, with small wooden cabins housing athletes near the stadium. This simple entrance started a tradition that later became one of the biggest parts of every modern Olympics. In 1920, 3 Yagan people were photographed in Tierra del Fuego, one of the coldest inhabited regions near the southern edge of the world. The Yagan are often called the world's southernmost indigenous people, with a history shaped by sea travel, harsh weather, and remote islands. In 1923, Bessie Coleman posed in her pilot uniform after traveling to France because American flight schools would not train her. She learned French, earned an international pilot license, and returned to the United States, determined to open aviation to more students. In 1925, a young Tibetan aristocrat posed in ceremonial clothing covered with heavy jewelry from head to toe. The wide hair ornaments and long bead strands showed family rank in Old Tibet, where dress could signal status before a word was spoken. Around 1924, a man in the Alps played an alphorn, a long wooden horn once used to send sound across mountain valleys. Farmers also used it to calm dairy cattle before milking, and its roots may reach back nearly 2,000 years. In May 1929, Peggy Ashcroft played Desdemona opposite Paul Robeson's Othello at London's Savoy Theatre. Robeson later made Othello a Broadway record, with his 1943 run lasting 296 performances. During an Italian expedition in Tibet in the 1920s, 2 men displayed a large ritual drum used in Lama ceremonies. Its deep sound could carry across the mountain air, turning a simple instrument into a signal of faith and power. In 1920s, Russia peasants gathered after the Civil War left villages broken, hungry, and without enough burial space. The image was remembered as "nowhere to bury the dead," showing how national collapse reached even the smallest family duties. In 1922, Queen Mary and King George V stood with Princess Mary and Viscount Lascelles on their royal wedding day. The marriage linked the British throne to the Harewood family, and Princess Mary became the only daughter of the king to marry during his reign. In June 1921, Tulsa's Greenwood district, known as Black Wall Street, was left in ruins after one of the worst racial attacks in United States history. Hundreds of homes and businesses were destroyed, erasing one of the richest black communities in America almost overnight. Jess Stahl rode Crowfoot at the Harney County Roundup in Burns, Oregon in 1928, showing black cowboys were part of rodeo history long before they were widely recognized. The writing on the photo names both rider and horse. A young newspaper carrier balances a canvas bag and folded papers on a bicycle from an era when children delivered the morning news door to door. By the late 20th century, many paper routes shifted to adults and cars as home newspaper delivery began to fade. Two shoemakers worked behind a shop window when repairing shoes was still a common city trade, not a rare specialty. In the 1940s and 1950s, many schools even taught shoe repair because worn shoes were fixed again and again instead of replaced. The F9 F3 Panther was tested with the Emerson Aero X 17A, a strange movable nose turret meant to aim without turning the whole jet. The idea looked futuristic, but fixed forward designs won, making this Panther one of the oddest dead-end jet experiments. Mary Moorman captured the Dallas motorcade at one of the most examined seconds of 1963. Her photo became key evidence because it was taken from only a few feet away, almost at the exact moment history changed. Robert Capa photographed captured German soldiers being roughly handled by a United States soldier in Leipzig on April 18, 1945. United States military censors blocked the photos because they showed a darker moment just days before World War II ended in Europe. In May 1941, soldiers of Germany's 5th Mountain Division sat inside a Junkers Ju-52 transport plane on the way to Crete. The Crete operation became one of the first large airborne campaigns of World War II, with Ju-52 planes carrying troops straight into the island fight. On April 20, 1941, nurses cleared shattered beds and rubble inside St. Peter's Hospital in Stepney, East London. The overnight attack became known as the Saturday, with the Docklands hit hardest and 449 people reported dead across London. In 1939, a day laborer in Rawls, Texas, fixed the feeder gear of a planter by hand under the open farm sky. During the Great Depression, this kind of field work often meant long hours, low pay, and no machine repair crew. In 1954, a Houston family posed with canned food, water, tools, and first aid supplies for a Cold War civil defense drill. The photo shows how nuclear fear entered ordinary American living rooms, even beside children and a family dog. On April 24, 1944, a United States soldier was caught by a blast during a daylight patrol in a narrow Italian village street. The photo is rare because it captured the split second when a normal street corner turned into a battlefield. Heite, a German paratrooper commander, was found near Monschau and treated by American medics after the Ardennes campaign. His military path had passed through Poland, France, Crete, Russia, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and Belgium. Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem was left in ruins in 1948 after 3 truck explosions linked to Palestinian Arab fighters and British deserters. Reports listed 58 people who lost their lives and up to 200 injured, making this one of Jerusalem's darkest 1948 scenes. Jacobus Onnen was photographed in the late 1930s before being linked to the infamous Last Jew in Vinica image. He was a teacher from an educated family and joined the Nazi Party before Hitler took power. German soldiers surrendered their rifles in Soest on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany's official surrender in Europe. The huge pile of weapons beside them shows how quickly a defeated army turned into lines of men waiting to be processed. In 1911, mail in Iceland still moved across open land by horse, with letters packed in small boxes on each animal. The route could cross empty fields, rough ground, and long distances before roads and cars changed rural delivery. John F. Kennedy was sworn in at the United States Capitol on January 20, 1961, with Eisenhower, Johnson, and Nixon all present. The frame captured 4 presidents or future presidents sitting within the same transfer of power. John Bodkin Adams reads the 1957 headline announcing he was found not guilty in one of Britain's most disturbing medical trials. Between 1946 and 1956, 163 of his patients died in comas, and 132 left him money or valuables in their wills. In 1958, 18-year-old Lowell Lee Andrews stood in the snow while police divers searched the Kansas River for discarded evidence. Newspapers had called him the nicest boy in Wolcott, making the case feel even more chilling. In 1975, Augusto Pinochet sat beside Imelda Marcos at Francisco Franco's funeral in Spain, placing 3 authoritarian regimes in one frame. Pinochet ruled Chile, Marcos represented the Philippines' ruling family, and Franco's rule had just ended after nearly 40 years. On June 5, 1989, Beijing residents stood with bicycles as PLA tanks moved near Tiananmen Square. The photo became a stark record of ordinary people facing military power one day after the protest crackdown. I will be very grateful for your subscription to the channel. Every day I try to tell you about such interesting historical photos.